Hi everyone, my name is Ryan H. Lewis. Today we're going to talk about the 5 heaviest serverless announcements at reInvent 2020. This was a very interesting and kind of noteworthy reInvent this year for many different reasons. First of all, 2020 has been crazy as a result of kind of everything that's been going on. reInvent was virtual this year, which is a first for the conference. One of the great things is that me sitting at home, instead of having to go to some big convention center in Vegas, I was able to watch all of the talks, all of the keynotes, all of the demos, see all of the announcements. My dog, who I also registered with me, was able to sit next to me while I watched a lot of these things. So that was great for me, and she got some treats. So it's good for her. But usually at every reInvent, AWS kind of focuses on a few different kind of overall themes. And while machine learning was huge this year, it's pretty much been huge for the past few years, but this year, if you look at the announcements just by quantity, the machine learning was crazy. But I'm really big into serverless, right? And I love to find out what they're focusing on, the announcements they're releasing for serverless. And this year there were quite a few very interesting ones that you would be interested in and I was very excited about. So we're going to look at those today in this video. All right, the first heavy announcement from this year is that they released container support for AWS Lambdas. So when I actually first heard this, I thought, okay, you already have Fargate. What do you need containers for Lambda? And then I started to dig into the details of this and it made a lot of sense. So the idea with containers isn't necessarily that you would take your existing containers running on ECS and launch them directly onto Lambdas. The code that's running in these containers for Lambdas are still going to be the same kind of code that you are like deploying in your normal workflow. There's a few main differences though that make this really exciting and honestly kind of make me want to start deploying containers on Lambda like today or tomorrow. So the first big thing is that there's always been a limit to Lambda packages, right? If you're uploading from the client, it's 50 megabytes. Either if you're uploading from S3, it's much larger. They don't really publish that amount, but either way, unpackaged, it has to be less than 250 megabytes, which, you know, for a lot of applications that should be okay, but if you've got a lot of dependencies, if you're trying to ship binaries, it just doesn't really work. And so with these containers, you now have a maximum of 10 gigabytes for your container images, which means that, I mean, you can do almost anything. If you have a single Lambda function that needs more than 10 gigabytes, I think you've got some optimization problems. So 10 gigabytes is a big change. Also, to support this container stuff, AWS has released a lot of new container images that contain the Lambda runtime on the container itself. So you can't just take a normal container and just throw it up on Lambda and expect it to work. You do need to implement and have this container runtime running on it, but AWS has already released all of these and they include all of the different platforms that Lambda supports, like Node and Python and Java and Go and things like that. The other cool thing that they've released with this is an emulator, a local emulator that you can run and test your Lambda functions locally. So this is huge because up until now, the kind of local support for testing and executing your Lambda functions locally has kind of always depended on the platform you were using. So I always use the serverless framework and I use it to deploy JavaScript applications. So there's kind of easy ways for it to stand up and invoke your JavaScript Lambda functions locally, but other platforms it doesn't support in the same way. So now that now that Lambda is supporting these containers, it can emulate the container kind of running system locally, and it can run any of the platforms on Lambda. So that's super cool. That is a huge innovation. probably the greatest thing about all of this is it's available right now, not in all regions, but almost all regions, and it doesn't cost anything more. So, I mean, there's really no reason not to jump on it today. All right, the second heaviest announcement for serverless at reInvent this year is Lambda millisecond billing. So you might not care about this if you're not paying the bill for your AWS account, but some of us aren't that lucky. I'm definitely footing the bill these days. And so here's how this works. So traditionally, since Lambda launched, it's always had 100 millisecond billing. So that means if you have a Lambda function that's either really, really quick, or you've got it maybe on a cron job, a schedule, and you're just kind of checking some things to see if your Lambda should run, but then it doesn't run, you have always been charged for at least 100 milliseconds in all of these different cases. So basically, AWS was seeing that this wasn't working for a lot of people. A lot of companies and a lot of teams probably wanted to use Lambda a lot more, but they have these Lambda functions that are very kind of like micro. So they only run like for a few milliseconds. And to be charged for 100 milliseconds, like every single time that run, that can really add up. So being able to only be charged for the milliseconds that your Lambda runs is huge, and it's going to save a lot of teams and companies a lot of money. So this is really big. The other thing to take note about this is, however, that your requests will still be billed. So with Lambda, you're charged by requests, and you're charged by the amount of time that your Lambda function is running. And so the amount of requests will still be charged as normal, but your millisecond billing is going to become much more precise. So this is a pretty big deal. I'm hoping that my bill will be a little smaller this month, because it starts this December 2020 cycle. So that's another big announcement. All right, the third heaviest serverless announcement at reInvent this year is that Lambda now has access to up to 10 gigabytes of memory. Holy moly, that's a lot. Unfortunately, I don't have any Lambda functions that could take advantage of that, but the upper limit was 3 gigabytes just like a few weeks ago before they made this huge announcement. So it's pretty crazy. This is going to enable you to do a lot more things with your Lambda functions. This partnered with that container announcement, allowing your containers to have 10 gigabytes of container images, a container image. This is going to go hand in hand and allow you to kind of do really heavy workloads with Lambda. I'm going to show you what that looks like. If you saw my last video, I launched this PS5 stock checker. You can check it in the link above. And so this is running in the Oregon region. And I know that the 10 gigabyte increase for RAM isn't available everywhere. So your mileage may vary, but you can see here, this used to be a little slider. I actually did the sliding in the last video. So this has changed in the last week. And now it's something where you can specify the megabytes, and you can see it can go up to 10 gigabytes, which is crazy. Remember that the amount of virtual CPUs, well, it says it right here. That's nice. It didn't used to say this. This is cool. Your function is allocated CPU proportional to the memory configured. So when you go up to 10 gigabytes, you are going to get some virtual CPUs to kind of match that. So that's really cool. This is pushing Lambda even further than before. So this is a great new change and announcement for Lambda. All right, for the fourth heaviest announcement from reInvent 2020 for serverless, we're going to look at Amazon Aurora Serverless version 2. This is big. We're moving past Lambda. It's had its time in the spotlight, and we're looking at some other serverless things on AWS. And version 2 of Amazon Aurora Serverless is pretty interesting, because AWS doesn't normally version their products. So this is I don't know if I would say a first, but it's quite interesting. The other thing is, what they're trying to do with Aurora Serverless is they're really trying to push serverless in kind of different aspects. They've kind of had compute for a while with Lambda. They've had kind of NoSQL, different kind of key value stores with DynamoDB, API Gateway. They've kind of touched all the things. They hadn't really touched relational databases until they announced Amazon Aurora Serverless a couple of years ago. But now they've got Amazon Aurora Serverless version 2, and it brings a few different innovations. The main innovation is that previously with version 1, it actually scaled, it was very kind of restrictive in the way that it scaled double every single time. So if you had these ACUs, I believe they're called, if you had 4 of those, it bumped it up to 8. So that's kind of like tough because your workload might not always need to double like that. So with version 2, they allow you to kind of specify the scaling. Initially, I think by default, it scales by 0.5 ACUs. So that's much better than just doubling it. Now, there is a downside to this, and it is that version 2 of Amazon Aurora Serverless is more expensive than version 1. So it may end up, I can kind of imagine it may end up in the long run being cheaper because when you scale, you're able to be more specific with your scaling. But, you know, it's always tough with these relational databases because they usually are very expensive. They're kind of the most expensive part of your application in the cloud. And with serverless, Amazon Aurora Serverless v2, it's only gotten more expensive. Still, this is one of the heaviest announcements. A lot of companies and teams are gonna jump on this right away. All right, and the fifth and last heavy announcement from AWS reInvent 2020 is that PartiQL, the SQL query language, is now available for Amazon DynamoDB. So let me explain this because you may not be aware of PartiQL if you're living in the serverless space. So PartiQL is this kind of transactional SQL-like language that AWS has kind of been pushing. I believe they created it, and they've had it implemented in a lot of different services around AWS, such as Redshift and S3, and I think Elastic MapReduce, and there's a few others. But basically, it allows you to kind of query your data and access your data using SQL, which is something that a lot of developers and operations people are familiar with, but kind of be able to access these services that before you'd have to query in a very specific way. So now that PartiQL language is available for DynamoDB, for your DynamoDB tables. And this is probably really exciting for anybody who loves SQL. I have put my SQL days behind me. I've actually been reading the DynamoDB book recently by Alex Debris, and that has kind of helped me understand the right way to model my DynamoDB data. And that doesn't include anything SQL-ish at all. So while this is interesting and might help people move over to DynamoDB, it's probably not going to be the best way to model your data. Still really interesting, and you can access it today in the DynamoDB dashboard. You can pull up a PartiQL editor and you can start querying your tables right away, which is really cool. This is kind of a new feature for serverless in general, and so it's cool to see the world of serverless expanding even more. Amazon Aurora, Lambda's getting containers, and now this SQL-like editor for DynamoDB data. It's pretty crazy. All right, those were the 5 heaviest serverless announcements at reInvent 2020, in my opinion. I just want to recap them real quick. We had the Lambda container support, which is very exciting. I'm probably going to do a video on that very soon. We had the Lambda millisecond billing, which is going to make my video that I do for you much cheaper. And then we had the 10 gigabyte limit for Lambda, so we can pump it up and see what that Lambda function can actually do. Then after the Lambda stuff, we looked at Amazon Aurora Serverless version 2, which is really great. I forgot to mention that scaling actually is happening in milliseconds now instead of kind of like a half second that it did before. So the scaling is also going to be faster, which maybe justifies the price a little bit more. And the last thing was the particle, I'm going to have trouble saying that, the PartiQL support for DynamoDB, which is pretty interesting, adds another dimension to DynamoDB. So that's it for this video. Thanks so much for sticking around and watching. If you liked it, or if you've already tried out Lambda Container support, give this video a like and subscribe to my channel for more content like this. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next week.